Ladies and gentlemen, we move on to the first session, Global Pulses Supply and Demand Outlook. This is going to be moderated by Brian Clancy of Stat Publishing Canada. The panelists include G. Chandrasekhar, Associate Editor, The Hindu Business Line, India; Sanjeev Dubai, Grain Trend Private Limited, Australia; Francois Dakar, Cargill, Australia; Boubacar Ben Hassan, Deputy Director, Trade and Market Division, Economic and Social Development Department of the Food and Agriculture Organization; and Anis Majid of Bombay's Group, Pakistan. May I please request our moderator and panelists to please take the seats at the dais. This session, moderated by Brian Clancy, Stat Publishing Canada, has been involved with the pulse industry for over 30 years. Started, of course, as a market advisory service for the Canadian industry, and this led to his job as an expert grain trader with All-State Grain Company, British Columbia. In 1988, he created Stat Publishing. He's no longer a trader, but he now leads Stat Publishing's efforts to provide world pulse industry with market news, statistics, and analysis. Our very eminent panel includes G. Chandrasekhar, Associate Editor, The Hindu Business Line. To all of you who are in the print media, he needs no introduction. He's a specialist in many fields, including agriculture, agribusiness, commodity markets. And he attends conferences all across the world, especially governmental conferences, where he advises on topics of macroeconomy, food, nutrition security, globalization, and World Trade Organization, amongst others. Sanjeev Dubai, Director, Grain Trend Private Limited, Australia. He co-founded Oz ePulse in 2001, and as its director, managed its operations, growing it into one of the successful pulses and grains trading houses in Sydney. He has a great understanding of the global pulses industry and actively deals with growers, trade participants, and logistics operators. He's also a Justice of Peace appointed for New South Wales by the Attorney General of Australia. Francois Dakar is Trading Manager, Feed Grains and Pulses, Cargill, Australia. He's been in the business since 1989 and has worked with various grains, oilseeds, and pulses trading management roles all across the world, including USA, Hong Kong, France, Australia. And he's been with Cargill, Australia since its acquisition of AWB in 2011. Boubacar Ben Hassan is the Deputy Director of Trade and Markets Division, Economic and Social Department at the UN Food and Agriculture Organization. Mr. Boubacar Ben Hassan is Deputy Director at FAO. He joined FAO as an economist in 2001, where he developed the organization's work on pulse markets and established working relations with CICILS IPTIC. Before that, he was Faculty Research Associate at the Food and Agricultural Policy Research Institute, University of Missouri. His areas of specialization include commodity markets, price and policy analysis, food security issues, and of course, ladies and gentlemen, the redoubtable Bombay's Group of Pakistan, Anis Majid, who needs no introduction. He's been doing human service. He's part of the Karachi Trade and Industry Organization. And in Pakistan, he's a major player, an international player too, in the food and pulses segment. Without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, it's now time to hand you over to your chair, Brian Clancy.
Good morning still. It's actually in Canada, it's afternoon right now, so it's, I actually feel pretty good. I was worried that I would be asleep at this point in time. It's kind of interesting. I think a lot of the Canadians came here in inverse proportion to the temperatures in Canada. People from Saskatchewan have been here for a couple of days. I'm on the West Coast, so I came in yesterday. People have a perception that Canadians live in igloos year-round. I can now tell you that's true. Yeah. We're hoping to, one of the interesting things is people are up until just recently, people were still ice fishing in Canada. This kind of creates an interesting thing for plant breeders, and I would challenge them to come up with varieties of plants and pulses that will allow us to do ice farming. We could use that this year. What we're going to do is I'm going to run through my own outlook for things just for a few minutes, and then we'll go through each of the panelists, and they'll bring their area in for their part of the world. I think in general we would the feeling is that pulse production in general will probably be fairly unchanged overall this year for the coming year, but within the sector there will be some fairly significant changes, with peas going up, lentils probably going down, beans little changed, and chickpeas probably very little changed. The first area I'll start with is world pea production. Here, because of the prices that we've seen, particularly for green peas, we're looking at a significant increased potential for green pea area around the world. This will happen in Canada, it'll happen in the United States, possibly in Argentina and other places. I think that the amount of acreage increase we could see for green peas will be limited by planting seed availability, and you know, that's going to be something that plays out over the coming months. Yellow peas will probably be not so much changed, up a little bit from last year, and that's just simply because the two markets have really performed very differently on a price basis. Green peas have been a couple of $100s a ton more expensive than yellow peas for much of the past 5 or 6 months, and that looks like it's going to continue all the way into new crop. In fact, the first trades of new crop peas for green peas have been at huge premiums to yellow peas. And it's that combination of really excellent prices for green peas, prices for yellow peas that are income competitive with other crops this year, and excellent movement that will stimulate an increase in production in countries where farmers are able to respond and able to produce more of the crops. You can see from here we're looking for a modest increase in Australia, a fairly large one in the United States, a reasonable one in Canada. The Canadian production might want to be higher, but the coldness that I talked about is going to be a factor, and I'll talk about that a little bit later on. Russia looks like it will be up this year. France, production in France will probably be up, but area will be down, and that I'm just thinking about long-term average yields. We'll have to see whether or not their weather conditions will allow that. One of the interesting things about peas, though, even with this increase in production, we're really looking at another year where the world is going to end up being basically sold out of peas, that the stocks-to-use ratios will stay very low. However, most of the carryover is going to move in. It's always held by Canada, the United States, France, to a lesser extent Australia, and that won't change. But you can see that those inventories are going to rise, but they're not going to rise to a level that would be considered burdensome or anything like that. So that will help keep prices firm through most of the coming year. And this is, they said I had to do price outlooks, and I hate doing price outlooks. I feel comfortable predicting where acreage will go, where production might grow. If it goes a different direction, I'm really confident in saying, well, I was right, but things change. But when I do prices, I just feel very uncomfortable. A lot of studies have said that the best way to figure out where prices will go in the future is to have a monkey throw darts at a bunch of numbers. That will be as accurate as anything you can come up with. And there's a reason for that. Some people will say, looking at a supply-demand chart, that they'll say, prices very rarely bear a relationship to that, so what's the use of that? And actually, it's a useful tool because it gives you an idea of the overall, where the overall tendency of prices ought to be. But price movement is a day-to-day thing, and it's the amount of product that farmers make available on any given day everywhere in the world, how much a retail consumer wants to buy a canner, whether or not there's a short or a long in the trade that needs to get exercised. It's all that multitude of factors that creates the independent, sometimes minute-to-minute changes in supply and demand, and that's what creates price. So supply and demand does work. It's just very hard to create a snapshot that's going to last for more than a few minutes. I think green pea prices are clearly going to stay strong through the end of this season and into the beginning of the next season. With the production increases, though, there is a very high probability that once we get into January, or perhaps even earlier, that green pea prices will adjust lower, and that just kind of makes sense. At that point in time, we'll be more concerned with what will happen with the Rabi season crops in India and other parts, that part of the world, to see whether or not we'll have momentum that will carry forward in price beyond that. Yellow peas, because the production is not likely to rise as much, I think that the prices will be trending upwards. You know, they'll move up and down, but I think there will be an underlying uptrend, and that will continue through the next season. So basically, green price is strong. I think personally think weaker in the long run. Yellow pea prices will continue to strengthen. World lentil production, I think, will be down a little bit, but within the complex, it's going to be interesting. I think there's a tendency for red lentils to want to go up in area in production now because of the strength of the market. Green lentils, on the other hand, there's a tendency for those to want to go down. Some people think it will be unchanged. I still think it will be lower. And that's just because the price for green lentils has not been brilliant, but more importantly, the movement hasn't been brilliant. And it's not that red lentil prices are so wonderful, it's that the movement has been really good. And that's what will make farmers want to grow them, I think. And so for them, they'll be looking at that as an option. Also, the longer-term price trend for red lentils looks fairly decent. On a supply-demand basis, we're finally clearing out our surpluses. Canada's been the main holder of the world's surplus of lentils, and that's clearing out through a combination of exports and domestic livestock feed consumption. I don't really know how much the feed industry in Canada is consuming, but it appeared to be quite substantial. It now appears to be smaller than we thought because more stuff is being exported than we thought, which either way it disappears is good because it's disappearing. And so we're looking at a situation where in the coming year, on a worldwide basis, we're going to move into a more reasonable and tighter stocks-to-use ratio, the kind that we like to see as traders, and the kind that begins to set the stage for price recovery and inevitably the next boom and bust cycle. For prices, green lentils, I think, will stay easier for the old crop, just simply because of the supply burden. However, because I think production is going to come down, that we'll see them move into an uptrend after August and September. Red lentils, I think red lentils are just going to stay firm. They're going to be choppy but firm, and we're not going to know until we know what next winter's crops are doing on the Indian subcontinent, whether there will be carry-through demand from that region to make markets stay strong throughout 2014. So it's just unanswered questions that overhang the market. But heading there, we're looking in good shape for prices. Bad if you're a consumer, good if you're an exporter. For world bean production, I think that the production will be basically unchanged. There will be a decline in the United States, a fairly substantial decline in the United States, judging from the seeding intentions report. That's going to be offset by increases in Brazil and some other parts of the world for a net little change. The increases in Brazil are probably of more concern to Argentina and China because it may affect demand for beans in the coming year, and we just have to wait and see how that plays out. From a supply-demand basis, I don't think beans are going to be very different from the average that we've seen. The stocks-to-use ratio for beans in the world remains really low. One of the things that when I do this is you do have to understand that I'm just trying to figure out how much inventory is being held by exporters and not so much how much is in the whole pipeline, because there's a massive amount of beans and other pulses throughout the whole food pipeline, which is one of the reasons that a short crop can take, you may need 2 short crops in a row to have a really strong price response. And that's just because you have so much inventory throughout the whole retail wholesale chain that needs to be eaten through before markets can change. For prices, for the U.S. beans, I used a price index. That was the most sensible way to approach it. It's heavily weighted towards pinto beans, with navy beans being probably one of the next largest components, and black beans after that, because it's based on production share. And I just see that market staying fairly steady, perhaps with a moderate uptrend. We'll have to adjust down at a certain level, but because of the production decline, we could see it trend upwards. Argentina, which I use for as a proxy for white beans, that market looks like it's just going to keep trending upward, and that's just because of the production problems that they think they're having this year. And we'll have to wait and see what that does to area next year. But it looks like the stage is set for a fairly firm market for the next several months. For chickpeas, I did Kabuis and Desis separately. By the way, all these slides will be available, so you don't have to jot down the numbers in a hurry. And we tried to reduce the amount that's up there. Production has the potential to actually be down a little bit, depending on where it moves around in the world, but basically very little changed from this past year. Output in Mexico should be up, and it's the price maker for the large caliber chickpeas, and so there's potential there for some easier prices later on, but they're being very careful in their pricing, and they're not being fast to try to lower their prices, which is a good thing. India, people were waiting to see what they would do to price. There appears to be, earlier there was some aggression there to sell and to be aggressive on price, and that seems to have relaxed a little tiny bit. From a supply-demand situation, again, it's just going to be very normal, very close to average, relatively tight ending stocks. So there's nothing there that jumps out at me and says that there is, that prices will want to collapse or anything like that. And if the prices stay high, we'll just get a slow and steady response in terms of production, which we can see. We're in an era of above average production and above average seeded area, but the consumption has been good enough, and I think we entered it with low enough stocks that it's taking a long time for inventories to rebuild and have an effect on price. And then for prices, it's just generally steady price outlook for Kabuli chickpeas. And I don't really see anything there that will change that unless the exporters in Mexico decide that they just want to dump on markets, or unless people in the United States and Canada start really chasing aggressively the 9mm markets. But I don't see that at this moment. For Desis, I think that we'll see an overall increase in Desi chickpea production in the coming year. I think Australia will, these guys will correct me, but right now my personal thought is Australia should want to continue at a high level of production. And because they had such good markets this year, good movement, decent prices. With India, I think that production has the potential to decline, but here I'm looking at long-term average yields, and I'm talking about the crop in 2014. I'm not talking about this year. This year's crop is the 8.09 million metric ton estimate. And for India, I'm never sure how to do numbers for India. When I look at the FAO numbers and other numbers, it appears that they combine Desi and Kabuli, so I've approached it from that perspective. If I'm going to be corrected, I'll have to reflect that in the future, not today. And it would be interesting if I was. Desi chickpea supply demand, Desis always are very tight at the end of the year, and when I do these things, I assume that a country like India or Pakistan, or less so Pakistan, but they are basically consuming what they grow, that all of what they produce enters the food chain, that the ending stocks are going to be held by exporting countries, so that's just reflected in a very low stocks-to-use ratio on a global basis, and that may be very different for individual countries. For prices, I use the Australian grower bid price as it's the one that I track, and they've come down a fair bit, and they may adjust lower. I think that there should be a firming trend for old crop, and that will remain in place. If new crop production rises the way I think it might, then we could see new crop prices be lower. You have a downward price adjustment, and we'll just have to see how they do marketing that crop and what kind of demand there is from India and other Pakistan and Bangladesh as to whether or not prices will be significantly lower, unchanged, or firmer in 2014. And I don't know how I'm doing for time. Probably not too bad, because I had 10 or 15 minutes. And I think that you're probably bored of hearing from me, and it's time to let these other gentlemen give us their opinions. Oh, this was sorry, Canada. My mind is lost. Canada, I'll just do a quick summary. Lentil production in Canada, I think, will be down. Green lentils down a lot, red lentils up a bit. Peas, green pea production up a lot. I think yellow peas will be fairly unchanged from last year. Beans in Canada will be down, mirroring what's happening in the United States. Chickpeas in Canada should be down. That would be a return to average yields. Last year's yields were above average. One of the problems that exist in Canada is our problem with the weather. Seeding is going to be delayed this year. It's going to be delayed 2 weeks, maybe more if the conditions don't smarten up in Western Canada, and that's something we just have to wait and see. The weather forecast for temperature and everything is fairly decent, and it suggests that seeding should be general by the middle of May, but every week that goes by where the winter doesn't recede, you have to think about that being later, and that just simply increases the risk to the crop of problems, various types of problems, principally a quality problem. Now we'll move on to the rest of the people. I'd invite Mr. Chandrasekhar to talk about India. His bio has been read out, so happily I don't have to do that. And we'll see what he has to say. I tried to prepare some questions for each of them, and I might wait and let them have their comments and then ask them at that point in time.
Let me talk about India's area production and import. These numbers are all available here. In the last 2 or 3 years, our area has obviously gone up to about 25 million hectares. And production took a very decisive break, upside break in 2010-11 to have gone to 18.2 million tons. And since then, my belief is India has broken the 14 to 15 million ton barrier. And India's production of pulses in future is going to be between 17 and 18 million tons. For 2013-14, the government of India has fixed a target of 19 million tons versus actual production of 17.6 million tons in the current year, 2012-13. And obviously, India will continue to remain the largest producer of pulses, consumer of pulses, and of course, importer. Look at the import numbers very clearly. Our average is about 3 million tons a year, plus or minus 10% depending on domestic production. For 2012-13, our import is estimated at 3.1 million tons. But I must mention to this House, production statistics are based on the crop year, which is from October to September, whereas the import numbers are based on the financial year, which is from April to March. And coming specifically to pulse-wise production, again, the numbers are all here. 2012-13, we've had 17.6 million tons production with the breakup Chana, of course, obviously topping the list with 8.6 million tons. Chana harvest has just got completed in India, and supplies are expected to continue over the next 2 or 3 months. And we are now looking forward to the 13-14 season. And as I said earlier, the production target for 2013-14 is 19 million tons. Whether we will achieve that or not depends much on the southwest monsoon, which we will have between June and September this year.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to save up, I prepared some questions for them in case you guys don't have enough, but I'm going to wait until we've gone through everybody before I do that. I don't want to spend too much time on anything. Sanjeev, we never did talk about what commodities you guys are going to talk about each, because we have 2 Australians here, which is a very unusual situation. So whichever ones you pick, Francois has to do the other 2.
Yes, and in fact, we have a lot of commodities as well. So I think we're having commodity panels later on during the conference. So would be careful to tread on toes, because there are commodities and there are origins. But just on the world supply and demand, I think that, Francois, if it's okay, that I talk about the peas and you can talk about the fava beans and lentils. Just on the chickpeas, the desi chickpeas, we've seen that India has come up with an average kind of a harvest. Mr. Chandrasekhar has given certain statistics. But what is different this year is the Pakistan harvest, where they're talking about a very much larger crop than what has happened in the past. In fact, Pakistan for years, I think it was last in 2005 that they were a net exporter of chickpeas. But this year it looks that it's quite certain that there would be a surplus, but not sure whether the export would be opened out of Pakistan or not. But Anis Majid would elaborate further. But just coming to the Australian chickpea crop, we think that the planting in Australia is going to be as much as what was last year. And anyway, given it's still a long way to go because there's still 2 months more for the harvest, for the planting and all to be completed. But we see a crop size of anywhere between 600 to 800,000 tons, and given the yield, because it's a fair way to go. But the difference that I see this year than what was last year, because last year also at this time, and this I'm talking about CICILS in last year, that we were expecting the same kind of a crop, but there was a certain amount of extra urgency in trading. But this year it's only over the past 2 weeks or so that it seems to have picked up from the Indian subcontinent, because the crops in the Indian subcontinent, the size-wise, is fairly formed. But still a long way to go. I think that just as a comment, that Australian growers are very, very happy with planting chickpeas in particular. They've had very good experiences. The prices have held up. It's only the Australian dollar that's not helping the Australian grower. Otherwise, I think chickpeas is there for the long term in Australia. That's it from me. And
Francois, you get faba beans and lentils.
Thank you.
Actually, I was going to say, don't worry about treading on the toes of the panel committees that are coming up. We're the global postal guys. We're the ones who really know. They're going to do their subsectors because they don't see the whole picture. We do.
Okay, so I'll tread on Sanjeev's toes a little bit. One comment I'll make about desi chickpeas, that the number you have there for last year's crop, 620, I think, is already proven to be too low, because we've already exported about 580,000 tons at the end of February. So if you add a very active export season in March to May to Bangladesh, which is typical, we'll find out the crop was probably over 700,000 tons, and which then goes to say that next year's crop, all going well, could be, again, 7 to 8, 900, why not, with good conditions. At the moment, it's a bit dry, but as Sanjeev said, we have plenty of time for more rains. On to lentils. Well, Australia is a fairly small, marginal player in lentils. But what we've seen in the lentils market over the last 2 or 3 years is a classic cyclical adjustment to an oversupply situation, which was led very much by Canada, as you mentioned. So Australian growers reacted to the drifting lower prices with planting a much smaller crop last year, which then combined with also a smaller crop in Canada resulted in this slightly lower world supply. But really the big factor here is not so much the production side in the exporting countries. It's what happened in the last 3 or 4 months is this much larger than usual demand from India, which has then created that spike in red lentils prices, which then calls into question whether we're going to see a continued drifting down of the lentils area in Canada and Australia. But as you said, probably growers will react to those prices. They still have time to plant more red lentils. Same is true of Australia if we do get rain, because the situation in Australia at the moment is quite dry. We've had 2 fantastic years in 10, 11, 11, 12, a little bit less last year, and we've really depleted the subsoil moisture reserves. And so we're going into the planting season this year with very little subsoil moisture. And so we're back to the sort of situations we had in the early and mid-2000s, where there will be a large risk premium on Australian crops, because there will be basically no room for error. We'll need good rains during the winter growing season. Quick word on faba beans. I think we've seen also the last couple of years a reduction in area planted to faba beans in Australia. Same thing. Reaction from farmers to lower prices, but also strong competition from other crops such as canola, which have had very strong price for several years and have really incented the growers to grow more of that, less of pulses. Both canola and pulses are viewed by Australian farmers as rotation crops. So Australian growers primarily grow wheat, but they need rotation crops, break crops to break the cycle, and canola and pulses take that role. I would expect we'll see a slight increase in fava beans area this year because prices were quite good last year during harvest. However, we may lose some acres in the north of the country in New South Wales where it's too dry, and the ideal planting window is closing soon. And if we lose area to fava beans, then we'll probably see an increase in chickpeas because that's another pulses crop that can go in the ground in the same areas. So something to follow. We need rain very soon for most of our pulses crops.
Okay. Thank you. Ask Ben Bahassan to speak now. With the FAO, I was hoping you could give us a very big overview of all of this stuff. That would be interesting. I'm sure everyone will be excited to see what you have to say.
Okay, thank you, Brian. First, let me thank the organizing committee for their invitation and to wish CICILS IPTEC a happy 50th anniversary. Also to say that FAO used to be more active within the activities of the CICILS IPTECs, and now we are coming back, so hopefully we strengthen our relationship. Coming back to your question, in fact, in the last few years, unfortunately, we lost a little bit our work on pulses. Now we are trying to develop it again. So I will not, frankly, venture to talk about short-term price outlook, and that's due to different reasons. And then you mentioned that you are not comfortable with that, so I share that sentiment with you. Nevertheless, there are maybe few issues I would like to highlight with regard to the pulse market and talk a little bit how we see probably prices behaving over the next 2 to 3 years, more or less. So the first thing, the observation on the tightness of the market, which Brian, you rightly mentioned or indicated. The markets are very tight, and this, when we look at the stock-to-use ratios, they are very low, except maybe for like lentils, which stands at 13%. The other ones, they are ranged from 1, 3 to 6%. And if we translate this, because their ratio, they are measuring utilization. So we are talking about, in fact, less than one month of global utilization, which is very tight, in fact, making markets vulnerable to any shock, especially from the supply side. The other part is the interesting, or the growth in trade in pulses over the next decade or so. We see in volume terms, trade has increased by more or less 27%. In value terms, that's even more. It has increased from 3 billion to more or less about 7 billion now. And if this tells us something, it tells us about the growing imports of trade in ensuring domestic consumption in various countries. Now, the other issue also related to this is the increasing linkages with other agricultural commodities. And in fact, this was hinted to in the opening statement about the pressure, increase in pressure on resources, and mainly land and water. So for that reason, farmers usually have to make decisions in planting, and that will be based on incentives, on returns. And from what I see, from what's happening, and from the security, from the food security point of view, also the policy dimension or the government policy making behavior, if we combine this, we can see a lot of pressure happening on the crops like pulses or roots and tubers, which may actually push them into more marginal lands. And that means more variability in yields in production, and that's more variability in prices. So at least in the short term, let's say in the next 2 to 3 years, what we see that prices will continue to be strong, and there is a lot of resilience in demand. And if you've seen, even though with the economic and financial crisis that's been happening, there is a lot of resilience in demand. We are not seeing demand really coming down or responding. It's very inelastic. And this probably one of the factors that's this increasing share or proportion of the middle class. Also, in all the issue now, the World Bank is also talking about the mega cities. So this all contributes to resilience in demand and strong demand. The other part will be the cost of production, and that's related, of course, to the energy part. So we don't see a slowdown there that will keep pressure on prices. Then, of course, the other factor, which I mentioned, the competition on resources. Then, in addition to this, I think the level of prices, or this issue of increase in the prices, there's the other issue of price volatility, which has been really drawing a lot of attention from leaders. Like the G20, 2011 was a big focus on the price volatility. And I think this will continue. We see it also continuing for pulses. Fortunate for business, but prices, it's very hard to predict. They will go up and down from one day to the other. As I mentioned before, the stock to use ratio is very low. But also there are other factors, for example, trade concentration. In fact, looking at the pulse market, you see in some commodities, like 90% of the export share is covered by 5 or 6 countries. So any production shock in one of those countries can really translate into price responses. Also in the import side, for some commodities, India is really having the lion's share in imports. Again, a shock to production or increased demand will translate into prices. And of course, the yield and the production, as was mentioned again in the keynote speech, I mean, we need more innovation. We need more varieties that's resistance to climate change, to shocks, and so on, in order to have a more stable yield. So I will stop there, but at least for the next 2-3 years, that's what we see in markets development for pulses, between continuing strength in prices, but associated with that, the issue of price volatility. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Anis Majid, how do things look in Pakistan? I think you have some numbers here for us. So,
thank you, Brian. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I would like to present the overall situation of the pulses in Pakistan. Basically, the consumption of Pakistan is 1.1 million to 1.2 million for all the pulses. And basically, the most consumed item in Pakistan is the desi chickpeas. And the desi chickpeas this year seems a very good crop, and we are expecting 900,000 to 1 million tons crop. Whereas the last year it was 291,000 tons, which was quite low, and we had to import a good quantity. But this year it seems that we will have to export. But it's a little difficult because we have the elections in May, and now we have the interim government. So we have to get permission for the exports, because exports are not allowed from Pakistan. And after the new government, we'll try to get the permission to export the desi chickpeas from Pakistan, because we have a bumper crop this year. And other pulses which are there in Pakistan, it is almost 600,000 tons crops production is the normal there, and around 600,000 tons regularly every year we import different kind of pulses. And mostly we have some border business over there is with Iran and Afghanistan. So the green mung beans mostly is coming from Afghanistan to Pakistan, and other imported items are coming from the seaports. And this year, hopefully, everybody will not be eating the desi chickpeas as the crop is good, but other crops, other pulses are also consumed, but we'll try to export these additional production. Thank you very much.
thank you. I'm going to put on, we'll put it there. And if we need to return to any slides, I'll try to remember roughly where they are and go quick. As I mentioned, I've tried to come up with some questions for people, but I would rather have you all ask questions. And if anyone has one now, we can go there. Yes, we do.
Albert Garcia from Spain. I have a question for Mr. Chandrasekhar. I'd like to know, in your opinion, about the Kabuli chickpeas on big size. What's your estimation on the size crop and the price trend, please?
As I showed in the table, the estimate of chana or gram or desi chickpea production is 8 million tons this year, which is now just completed. The harvest has been completed. Of that, you can take the Kabuli part at about 500 to 600,000 tons. 8 million tons is the production, total production of chana, as we call in India. If you're looking at the price, did you ask me about prices?
Yes, please.
Okay. Before I answer that question, Brian, may I take the liberty of looking at the big picture for prices? Is that okay?
Yeah.
Before I answer the specific question, okay, let me.
You can't take too long, though.
No. from what Brian compiled and the projections, very realistic projections that Brian has made for 2013-14, at least I get a sense that the market's going to be fairly well balanced in 2013-14. And a well-balanced market actually creates a big risk for prices. Very simply because even a small change in either demand or supply will have a disproportionately larger impact on prices. The market is in surplus, we know how the prices are going to behave. The market is in deficit, we know it. And therefore, next year, 2013-14, is going to be a very tricky year in terms of price forecast, simply because the market is going to be tightly balanced. Yeah. And that's something which people have to be careful about when you trade. Coming to your question, we've already seen the chana prices in India decline from a high of about 40,000 rupees a ton to currently 33,000 rupees a ton, almost a 20% decline. But I expect prices to stay stable over the next couple of months, and depending on the onset and progress of southwest monsoon between June, July and August, if the monsoon is normal and if the next planting of the crops in general is satisfactory, I think prices will stay stable. And if there are any aberrations in the monsoon, I expect prices to kind of rise and spurt further from the current level of about 33,000 rupees a ton.
I'm Viktor Korobka from Ukraine, and my question is to Mr. Majid. Mr. Majid, how do you consider the role, let's say in 1 year time or 5 year time period, for such emerging agriculture exporters like Ukraine, Russia, maybe Ethiopia? Please respond.
The markets are very important. The Russian market and the Ukrainian market are very important because I don't know, the cost of production is low, but the prices you offer to the market, international market, is quite reasonable, so, and quite competitive. So the Pakistan is buying a lot of yellow peas from Ukraine and Russia because of your prices as compared to the Canadian market. And other commodities you are offering are also like wheat and also in the price which are very competitive. So of course the market, the people, the players in the market also look at the prices. And if your prices are reasonable and competitive, definitely people prefer to buy from Ukraine and Russia.
Anis, this question is addressed to you. From the grid that you put up on the screen just now, it showed that Pakistan had a surplus of 250,000 tons of chickpeas. So what do you think will be done with this chickpeas? Will this be kept as a carryover stock, or will it be exported? Will the government open up exports, or is there already some export happening? Is there any cross-border trade happening? Because 250,000 tons in a tight balance sheet, as Francois was saying, with the exports happening out of Australia, could be a significant number. So what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, as I've already mentioned that the production is good this year, and we'll try to get permission from the government that they should allow this export for the desi chickpeas from Pakistan, as it is banned from Pakistan to be exported. But the cross-border business is being done, and some smuggling is also done. So therefore, we would suggest government that, because it's like a water flow, if the prices are low, very low in Pakistan, definitely it will move up from anywhere. So we'll suggest the government to give us the permission to export it officially. So there is good for economy of Pakistan also, and the farmers will be happy because they will be growing same kind of production next year if it is allowed to be exported. So we'll press the government to allow the exports of the desi chickpeas from Pakistan.
One more question.
Yeah, I think I can just add that there will be a certain amount of possibly substitution also, because Pakistan does import, let's say, about 10,000, 120,000 tons of yellow peas, but maybe half that amount, 60,000 odd tons, probably would be converted into desi chickpeas. So it could well possibly just get get consumed if exports are not allowed.
Yeah, you are correct. So half of the consumption of the yellows will go to the desi chickpeas, but yellows has also the parallel market in Pakistan also. So yellows are also needed, but of course it will be required half as the desi chickpeas will be taking over. But in any case, we will be having an excess crop of desis, so we need to be exported, you know, if government allows.
Anish, just to get the price perspective, if the exports were to be allowed, what are the current prices in Pakistan for chana?
Yeah, it is around $475 to $500 in Pakistan. So if it is allowed, that definitely, if you can add the freight, that would be a little cheaper from any other part of the world.
Thanks.
But mind you that there's a possibility of putting an export tax by the Pakistan government, so there'll be a revenue for the Pakistan government probably.
Yeah, nothing like
just one last one, Anish. What are the chances on a scale of 1 to 10 that the Pakistani government will allow exports?
Actually, we are not sure about that because the elections are on 11th of May and whose government comes. But if the wise government comes, then they should allow.
Actually, one thing I was wondering about this season on Australian desi chickpeas, they were sold very aggressively in the early part of the year. Do you think that right now there's a perception that green peas and red lentils that Canada, well, Canadians in particular, are not very eager to sell new crop? And I just wondered if you think that there will be a tendency for Australian farmers and exporters to want to try to step in there ahead and kind of sneak in and take some of that market while we're sitting back navel-gazing.
I'll take that one. I think you have to look at prices as always. When last year Australian farmers or the Australian trade was willing to sell aggressively the chickpea crop, prices started above $700 CNF India. So at those prices, farmers will sell and the trade will sell because we have a large crop that needs to be moved at harvest. It's a cash crop for most farmers. But I think this year farmers will respect the dry weather a bit more. They will, and also having got very good prices last year, they will probably want to start the season with the same sort of prices. So at a price you'll see selling. And I would say that the markets are not that far. We've heard of trades or trade discussions around the 650 level CNF India, which is not a bad price in absolute. But the crop needs to get in the ground, and that's we'll find out more in the next 4 to 6 weeks.
Okay. Thank you. Any other questions from the floor? Actually, there's an area here that we didn't talk about, and I would be interested in your comments, Ben. President Obama has suggested some changes, significant changes in food aid policy in the United States. They're just part of his budget proposal, so there's no assurance or guarantee that they're going to make it through Senate and Congress. And in fact, basically what he's talking about is eliminating the one part of the policy where they were giving food to agencies, overseas NGOs to resell. And the other area of change that they're talking about is reducing the component of U.S. originated product from 100% to 55%. And what I was wondering about whether or not, I don't want you to comment on whether or not that such a change is a good one or a bad one or anything of that nature. But if the United States, who is the single largest food aid donor in the world, were to maintain the money at the current levels and were to make that change in the way they're originating product for emergency food aid, do you think that would be quite a positive development for the pulse industry in Africa and some of the other developing parts of the world? That would be an area that would be very helpful in terms of helping increase production around the world and perhaps even increase consumption?
Yeah, Brian, thanks. That's an important question. No, certainly any change will have impact, at least in the short term, but that could have an impact on the short term. The size, we have to see the size of the food aid. I mean, that of the parts that go to the food aid, I don't know if that the impact, how huge that impact will be, but it will have an impact. I think over the medium term, there should be an adjustment in the market to absorb that impact. I don't see that they will have that really a lasting impact. It could be positive, but again, if there is a response from markets, from a lot of, at least what we focus on in FAO, more of the developing countries where there is a lot of capacity, supply side constraint. But if those can be addressed, I think that could have a positive development. But nevertheless, I also want to underline that the dimension of food aid, what we call, is part of our social protection safety nets, is very important also for food security. So hopefully that will not impact the poor and vulnerable for pulses which are very nutritious products. Yeah. So that would be my take for it, at least at the first go.
Just to help everyone, in the last 5 years, the USDA has bought an average of about 100,000 tons of yellow peas, probably around 30,000 tons a year of green peas, and around 26 or 27,000 tons of lentils. So the impacts here that we're talking about might be, if it were to go all the way, and depending on how it's allocated, maybe 25,000 tons of yellow peas as not going into food aid compared to now as a possibility, but this is very speculative.
Thanks, Brian. Tim McGreevy from the USA Dry Pea and Lentil Council, and I just wanted to address the food aid question since you brought it up. I think it's very unlikely that Congress will pass the President's request, although it certainly will generate a great deal of discussion. I think you have to be quite cautious. Currently, the U.S. contributes $300 million to in-kind cash purchases in local regions, and they contribute about 1.2 to 1.5 billion in-kind crop, from the U.S. origin to those in need. If the President's plan or something like that were to go through, I think you could witness a steep decline in cash donations and overall food donations from the U.S. Because politically it would be very unpopular to do that. So I think some are pushing to go towards more cash donations, but I think the reality is it would mean less food in the pipeline and donated to those in need. So thank you.
I was wondering about that too. Thank you. We've only got 36 seconds left, so we're going to have to wrap this up. I want to thank the panelists very much for their excellent responses, and you all for making it impossible for me to ask questions, which I really appreciate. So thank you very much for being a good audience, and thank you very much, my panelists.
Once again, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to thank our panelists for this wonderful Clancy Motors the Center. Great photo opportunity. We all need to make these momentous occasions forever, especially this is the Golden Jubilee. To the gentleman next to Sanjeev Francois Dakar of Cargill, Australia. Moving on to the gentleman who's holding center stage. He was held center stage in Pakistan too. He's been unprecedented 5 times chairman of the Karachi Wholesalers Growers Association and its general secretary 5 times before that. Mr. Anis Majid, chairman Bombay's Group Pakistan. From the Food and Agriculture Organization, Bubakar Ben Hassan, Deputy Director, Trade and Market Division, Economic and Social Development. Next to you, sir. Thank you, sir, for being with us. And the air full of information and loquacious, G. Chandrasekhar, Associate Editor, Hindu Business Line. From Stat Publishing Canada for efficiently moderated this fantastic discussion, Global Pulses Supply and Demand Outlook, Brian Clancy, I'll do the honors.